So you mentioned reality, like when you saw reality, and this is what I've been trying to promote. So in my clinical practice, I'm empathetic, I'm compassionate, I'm non-judgmental, but I provide a safe space. When we talk about safe space, it's not the safe spaces where you curl up in a ball and blow bubbles. It's a safe space as in you're not going to be judged while you go through this process of trying to understand your experience, and most importantly, to base it in reality. I don't feed into someone's delusional thoughts, and I put quotation marks delusional, because that's not helpful, because in order for that to work, the rest of the world has to adapt to this false belief, this false narrative you had. And if you're the only person who believes this, like when I'm dealing with my patients, it's not
Yeah.
to work. And I tell people, hey, if you become rich and you can create your own little fantasy park where everyone walks in accord with your beliefs, great, but that's not how reality works. So I'm able to try to elevate people from a position of strength. And again, it's not to dismiss it. This is where people are so black and white in their thinking. I'm not saying, oh, suck it up or nothing bad happened. It's like, yeah, it did happen. Now, how are we going to move forward in the most adaptive way for you? And what you were
Yeah.
describing is the opposite of that. It's no, I want everybody else to suffer just like I did. And the fact is, as you're saying, the suffering may not have been to the same degree or the same manner that the common narrative portrays.
Hmm.
So I don't think it's very helpful for people to adopt this false reality, number one. And then number two, I should say it out there. And I said this to Karen Strawn. I think she bristled when I said it. Just because I'm stubborn, I'm not giving up the title of feminist. I am a male feminist.
Oh, I remember you saying that. Yeah.
Okay, but I'll say it for a few things here, because by saying male feminist, now that's even worse, because male feminists have a reputation of being two things. Either these creepy beta males who just
Yeah.
sneak in under the guise of being an ally and then just they're predators, which this does happen, or
Mhm.
they're the same kind of creeps, but they've attained some power. They're a celebrity. They're Ben Affleck's or something like that. And we realize, aha, they say that they're male feminists, but they're really creeps and monsters. So despite that, screw them all. I'm still going to say it because I keep saying it over and over. To me, feminism was something very different. My mother was not political. She was not ideological. She was not academic. She was a strong woman who evinced, I thought, all the qualities of a strong person. Not a woman, a person. So to me, feminism was sex was irrelevant in certain manner. Of course, sex is relevant in certain ways, but in others, for someone to be successful, a good person, strong, etc., I didn't look at the sex. That's to me what feminism should have been. And I've got three daughters, and I want to raise them in the same way. And I always say this, and I had one student take great offense, and I keep saying it over and over. I'm raising my three children not to be strong women, but to be strong people.
People.
Right?
Yeah,
That's
and of course, yeah, and that's what I think feminism, in its best moments, was about minimizing the importance of sex differences when they shouldn't really matter, and yeah, offering equal opportunities to men and women to flourish in the world, to use their talents, to make their contributions to society, to do whatever they're best at doing. No one should be held back because he or she is a man or a woman or whatever. And I think, yeah, I haven't met a man who doesn't agree with that. I really haven't. And I've had now, since I started speaking, of course, lots of men, young and old, and everywhere in between, write to me and talk about their philosophies of gender difference. And the vast, vast majority of men are feminist in that sense. They're
they're
happy to have,
egalitarians.
yeah, they're egalitarians. They're happy to have women succeed in the workplace if they're talented enough to make a contribution. They don't have bigoted ideas about women being limited just because they are biologically female. I don't know any men like that. Maybe there are a few still around, and it's true, some men have, and women too, have a more traditional view of sex difference and the importance that it plays in society and in the family, for instance, and things like that. Well, people can disagree and argue about that. But the basic rights that feminism was concerned about earlier, which was the right for a woman to fulfill herself as an individual, to make her contribution to society regardless of her sex, that was won years and years ago. And we now are focusing on issues that either, as you say, are entirely distorted, or questions of, for instance, the Me Too movement or the, Believe Women movement, in which we are supposed to imagine that women are very fragile creatures who can't bear to hear a sexual joke or to have a man look at them or compliment them or anything, that this is somehow such a heinous blow to their self-esteem that very serious disciplinary measures need to be taken against that man, and serious measures need to be put into place in the workplace so that they can be protected from all of these kinds of things, which is the exact opposite, of course, of what feminism in its better moments said that it stood for. So it's quite bizarre. It's almost as if feminists themselves are now undermining feminism and putting into place a kind of Victorian notion of how weak and delicate women are and how they must be protected from predator men. And yet often the examples that are given of the sorts of predation that women have to be protected from aren't predation at all. They're just, a man saying, hey, I love you. I'd love to take you out on a date. And they'll claim that there's some sort of innate power imbalance that is very damaging to the woman. Or I was reading an article just recently, a woman writing about how she believed the claims against Senator Al Franken because he had once, and this was a very serious article in the Atlantic magazine, which I used to think of as a very, intellectually serious magazine. She had her picture taken with him at the inauguration of President Obama, and he squeezed her when they had their picture taken. He held on to her waist. Of course, she was fully clothed, and he squeezed her twice. And, she's remembered this and carried around. It was so damaging that he squeezed her twice, and so she knows that indeed he is a terrible person, and she believes the allegations against him. And, and so many of the Me Too allegations, of course, they're not all trivial, but so many of them are trivial in that way. I don't know what to make of them. I mean, what kind of a movement brings forward such allegations and pretends that they should take up even a second of our public conversation? Only a movement that has lost any kind of contact with reality, and not a movement that should be taken seriously in any way. And yet we all are supposed to speak of it in sort of hushed tones and, oh yes, and we should take this very seriously. Yes, we realize this is very painful for these women to talk about. Oh, it takes great courage to come forward to tell this terrible story of somebody who squeezed them once while they were having a picture taken. It's bizarre.
It is, and unfortunately, and I've said this so many times, this is all, to me, not just in feminism, but with so many issues that we're dealing with today, it's a reflection of the loss of nuance, loss of scale or scope, and unfortunately black and white thinking. So by you saying that, they're assuming that you're minimizing or denying the legitimate complaints, the serious ones.
To treat them all as if they're equal is what, denies the serious one.
Oh, exactly. And Matt Damon, and I don't follow this crap, but because I do all, radio and TV interviews, I have to. Matt Damon got pilloried for saying exactly that. He said, look, certain behaviors in the workplace, all of them may be unacceptable, but there's a big difference between, let's say, squeezing a butt, which is wrong, and doing this other stuff. And everyone jumped all over him. And now they're going to probably boycott his next movie. It's ridiculous. Yeah. He tried to bring nuance into the picture because what people are failing to understand, I think a lot of people do now, but so many of these people who are promoting this mindset, they're failing to understand that what you're doing is actually disempowering women. You're causing a lot of anxiety, tension, everything, not just for women, but for men, because now no one knows what is acceptable.
Mike Pence, when he said that, he wouldn't have lunch with a woman alone and all of this, and yet, that makes perfect sense in the climate that we live in now. And now I'm seeing articles coming out where women are pleading with other women, to rethink this whole Me Too hysteria. And the message that sort of more moderate feminists are now beginning to put forward is that this is going to be really harmful to women ultimately. If men are no longer going to be willing to mentor women, men aren't going to be willing to engage in the kinds of social relationships that they've typically had when they're mentoring men in a business setting or whatever it happens to be, that, women are going to end up being shut out of the kinds of social relationships that make possible professional advancement. And, and it's like, you never thought of that before? I mean, talk about the law of unintended consequences. If you really want to go back to an era in which men and women never mingle together, or in which the rules that govern how men and women can relate to one another are so rigid, Victorian style and puritanical, of course that's going to have a negative impact on women's professional advancement in all sorts of ways. I mean, it seems to me ridiculous that in a climate where men's careers are being ruined through unfounded allegations, some of them ridiculously trivial, that we should be worrying about how this is going to damage women. But of course, in a, gynocentric culture such as ours, maybe that's going to be the only thing that might put the brakes on the current warlock hunt, as it's being called, is by considering the ways in which women are going to be damaged by it.
Exactly. And again, just so no one misconstrues anything we're saying, we're not denying that there are some really reprehensible people. Some women have had terrible experiences. In fact, I mean, the stats show many young girls and young boys suffer terribly within the family often. But none of this is to deny that these things are happening. But we can't wave a magic wand and say, Shazam, it's all better now. So we have to work within the reality that we have. And even when you said that men are not going to mentor women, well, the feminist response will be, why should they have to mentor them? Women should be there. We should just open them, and the women are all at the top there. So come on, Janice, what are you doing?
Yeah, well, and I do sometimes wonder if that is the feminist end game. Even a lot of women who might not explicitly call themselves feminists are actually okay with, and that is what you hear over and over again. Every time a scandal comes up, every time there's some discussion of some form of abuse in the workplace or elsewhere, the response is often, well, that's why we need to get women into positions of power in all of these businesses, as if women are never going to themselves engage in any form of harassment. And of course, women do engage in sexual harassment too, but women have all sorts of ways that they abuse power as well. But I think that is part of what fuels our current hysteria, is the way it can be used to assert that men should never be in any positions of power. So we used to have calls for mandatory equality at the upper echelons of professional positions. I think a lot of feminists would now like to say, no, we need 70%, 80% women in these positions of power, because of course women never abuse power and everything will be okay. And men can do the kinds of dirty work that women aren't interested in doing. And I think a lot of feminists think that that would be perfectly justifiable and good. Men can continue to service the electrical grid. They can continue to work in the sewers. They can continue to, of course, they'll have to go to war if there is another war. And, they can do all the dirty work. They can work in the slaughterhouses and all of the things that women aren't interested in doing. They can be out there at -30 and fixing the power lines when they're down. The other night, my husband and I were driving home from Ottawa, and some repair was going on to a city road, and it was 10:30 p.m. and there were a bunch of people. They'd opened up the road, and there were a bunch of guys down there with all their tools and equipment working away. And we said, how many women are down there doing this work? Of course, there were none, and feminists aren't, and they don't complain about the lack of women in those kinds of jobs, but they want more and more women in top-level, white-collar positions. And so I think that all of our current hysteria fuels those kinds of calls.
It's not to deny that there is an old boys club in many industries. It is changing slowly. And truly, there are some glass ceilings in certain industries, but it's not absolute. And there aren't certain sectors, as you say. I mean, there's a trade-off. There's a payoff, as you described. There are certain jobs that women aren't doing. And this is the hardest one, because I understand this is the one that's actually, I don't know what the solution is, where we recognize when we say that one of the reasons that women do not advance as well as men on average in many careers is, in order to do that, having kids, it's a stumbling block. I mean, that's a reality, and only women can have kids. There's no way around that, at least not yet. So I always acknowledge that I don't think society's done enough to compensate for that, but we can't deny that reality. And this is where Dr. Peterson gets in trouble. He made this comment in my class when he came and gave a lecture. People don't want to hear this, or some people don't, but there are many women who want to be mothers. They want to have the family. Maybe it's because it's hardwired in their DNA to be more maternal. And when they don't do that, when they do get the success and everything that they've been striving for, and they do work those 80 to 100 hours a week like many men do to get there, they're miserable. So why should we deny that? Why should we tell them, no, you should be doing that? That's so unfeminist to me. Where's the power of choice if a woman decides to do this, or a man, or whatever else? And that's the hypocrisy, where you've got to be the kind of woman that we say you have to be.
Yeah, and even those women often do make choices that mean that they don't advance in exactly the same ways that men do. And I'm not an expert in this by any means. And at this point, it's hard to know whether social conditioning or, biological reality or what exactly combination of both of those things accounts for these differences between how men and women work. And I guess feminists would say we haven't had enough time yet, although 50 years seems like quite a long time, but maybe in the grand scheme of things, it isn't long enough to really understand the degree to which social conditioning may play a role. But a lot of the kinds of things that are necessary to do to advance in really high tech fields or in scientific research, things like that, it involves becoming really obsessed with finding the solution to a problem, putting in hours and hours, like thousands of hours, trying to figure out the solution to a problem, being in a lab, shut off from other people, working in isolation perhaps for many, many, many years, pursuing the answer to something. And it just seems like at the really high levels of creativity and exploration and discovery that more men have that particular kind of obsessive focus that it takes to succeed. Women tend to enjoy other kinds of professional work, often, involving more social interaction, that kind of thing, helping professions, those kinds of things. And there's got to be some biological component to that. And there probably is some social component as well. But if we're going to start trying to micromanage and socially engineer all of this range of human activity and interest and behavior so that we get the outcomes that we think we want. I mean, that's just crazy. Why would anyone want to do that? And I think it's a recipe for disaster. Surely it is enough to make it possible for people to pursue their passions and to do what they're good at doing. And if we end up having gendered disparities in who rises to the top in certain kinds of professions, can't we live with that? What I want as a human being and want for everybody is for people to be able to do what they're good at. I don't want anyone to be held back because of some social bigotry or prejudice or whatever. But to start declaring that we have to have a certain number of women in these particular fields that women are still not pursuing, and to make such a big deal about a so-called pay gap, for instance, which anybody, it seems, who looks at the matter, and I'm not an expert, I'm not a social scientist, but it seems from what I've read that anybody who looks dispassionately at the actual evidence finds is that there is not discrimination against women in terms of pay. There are women making choices about how they spend their time, which results in their advancing differently in various professions and earning less than men in certain professions, and that results in the disparity that we see. And often, women make choices to live lives that are different. They don't want to put in the 18-hour days year after year after year.
Yeah, and Christina Hoff Sommers, the factual feminist, I mean, she's really the one, I think, who's blown that open. And, I mean, still, there will be some studies that do show, and this is where I want to show both sides. There are studies that show that if you give engineer professors 2 resumes, exactly the same, one with a male name, one with a female name, yes, they will respond to them differently in these studies. But because this happens, that's a study. It doesn't mean that it's systemic, and it doesn't mean that it's in every different field. And what I'm saying is we can't pretend that there won't be prejudices. There will. There will be against women, against men. That's part of human nature.
The question, too, is, where do those prejudices come from?
Right.
Does the prejudice come from the fact of 30 years of experience working with men and women in a lab and notice a difference? In which case, it's very difficult to say whether that's an actual prejudice, meaning a conception, based on a false idea, or whether it's something that's a result of a lengthy experience that has led this person to prefer men in certain kinds of situations. I mean, we have prejudices towards women in all sorts of situations too, which may partly be through experience and partly just through false conceptions. So, I mean, it's always hard to know what to do, even with those kinds of studies, as you say. There's been a recent study out of, I think, Cornell University that found that quite wide-scale study of university positions that found that women were twice as likely to be chosen for academic positions as men in the sciences. Because there is such a push now to hire more women into these positions, women now have a distinct advantage. And yet we still have all sorts of programs, especially in the hard sciences, to advantage women when they're already advantaged. I mean, we have now positions sometimes being advertised for women only, which I think is just outrageous in this day and age, that kind of sex discrimination against men should be countenanced in the name of equality.
And that's the problem, though, because so many people are afraid to stand up and say, wait a second, this might have made sense a number of years ago, but we've reached parity in certain cases, or equality or something like that. Why are we still pretending that the same circumstances exist? But people are afraid to do that. That's why I, in these different areas, am trying to just speak out. And it's not out of resentment. It's not out of feeling disadvantaged. I'm in a really good position. I don't have to say all this. It's just that I see it, and I just want to bring it up for discussion. I'm an expert in certain things, and there are many things I'm not an expert in, and I want to hear people. And I want to switch topics for a second. We're running out of time. I know Dr. Peterson, and I hate to sound like a sycophant, but he brought this up a number of years ago, where I believe it was Norway. It's a Scandinavian country where they have the most gender equality, and you do see the most disparity in choices for employment. When they give a choice, men and women act very differently, and there's no barriers to which place they want to go, and given that, they show their preferences. And this is heresy. People don't want to hear this. God forbid there could be some biological or some other explanation rather than just the patriarchy.